On the afternoon of December 9th, 1896, 4 members of the Hartford Mining Consortium entered the eastern mouth of Cutter's Pass in the Bitterroot Range of western Montana. According to the last entry in the expedition ledger, recovered 6 years later under 18 inches of sediment. They intended to exit the western mouth by nightfall and reach the railhead at Evaro by the following morning. None of them reached Evaro. None of them exited the pass. The names recorded in the departure manifest filed with the Territorial Mining Office in Missoula were as follows: Samuel Grafton, 41, surveyor and expedition lead; Ernest Holcomb, 37, geologist with prior experience in Colorado and Nevada; William Tandy, 29, assistant surveyor; Peter Rask, 19, camp assistant and nephew of the consortium's financial backer. They were not adventurers. They were salaried professionals conducting routine winter reconnaissance ahead of a planned copper claim filing in the spring of 1897. Grafton had led 11 prior expeditions without incident. Holcomb had published 2 technical papers on ore-bearing strata in the Transactions of the American Institute of Mining Engineers. Tandy had worked under Grafton for 4 years. Rask was the only member without formal credentials, hired largely as a courtesy to secure continued investment. The party departed Missoula on December 6th aboard a hired freight wagon driven by a contractor named Horace Lunt. Lunt's invoice, preserved in the consortium's accounting files, lists the delivery point as the eastern trailhead below Cutter's Pass, with return passage scheduled for December 11th. Weather conditions on departure were clear. Daytime temperatures hovered near 30 degrees Fahrenheit. There had been no significant snowfall in the region for 9 days. Lunt later testified that the men were in good spirits and adequately provisioned. Each carried a canvas rucksack containing hardtack, salt pork, coffee, matches, woolen blankets, and a tin cup. Grafton carried the company theodolite. Holcomb carried rock hammers and specimen bags. Tandy carried the surveying chain and a pocket compass. Rask carried the expedition ledger, a leather-bound notebook provided by the consortium for daily entries. According to Lunt's testimony before the territorial inquiry in June of 1897, Grafton informed him on the morning of December 9th that the party would not require pickup at the eastern trailhead. Instead, they intended to traverse Cutter's Pass and descend to Evaro, where they would board the Northern Pacific Line back to Missoula. Lunt accepted this without objection. The change reduced his contracted mileage. What Lunt did not mention to the inquiry, because he was not asked, was that he had advised against the traverse. This detail appears only in a marginal note in the private journal of Deputy Marshal Thomas Wickham, who interviewed Lunt informally in April of 1898. Wickham records the following: Lunt states he told Grafton the Salish wouldn't go through in winter. Grafton said they had the maps and didn't trust Indian superstition. Cutter's Pass was not unmapped. It appeared on the 1889 Territorial Survey as a narrow defile running 7 miles between peaks that rose to elevations exceeding 8,000 feet. The pass itself ranged between 9 and 14 feet in width. In summer, it served as a seasonal game trail. In winter, it was avoided. The avoidance was not superstition. It was hydrology. The pass channeled runoff from 3 converging watersheds. During seasonal thaw, meltwater descended through the defile in intermittent surges, carving vertical walls of exposed schist and depositing loose talus across the floor. In winter, the same channels froze into sheets of verglas that locked the walls and floor in a matrix of black ice. The configuration created what a modern geologist would term a Class 3 avalanche chute, with poor egress and no lateral refuge. The Salish name for the pass, according to ethnographic notes collected by the Jesuit mission at St. Ignatius, translates approximately as the place that closes. It was not used as a winter route. Tribal hunters detoured south through lower gaps that added 2 days to the journey, but remained passable. Grafton had maps. He had instruments. He had professional credentials and financial backing and a schedule that rewarded speed. He did not have winter experience in the Bitterroots. On the morning of December 9th, 1896, he made the decision that every document, Every recovered artifact, every testimony would later trace back to. He took the shortcut. The Hartford Mining Consortium was a modest enterprise by the standards of the 1890s. Its principal investor was Amos Rask, a grain broker in Hartford, Connecticut, who had diversified into Western mineral claims following the Panic of 1893. The investment was speculative but not reckless. Copper prices had stabilized. The Northern Pacific Railway had restored service through Montana. Territorial law favored claim holders who filed surveys promptly. Grafton's role was to identify promising outcrops, stake preliminary boundaries, and return with sufficient data to justify a formal claim application. The work was technical, but not dangerous. Most surveys were conducted during summer and early autumn. The decision to extend operations into December was driven by timing, not ambition. A competitor consortium had filed claims on adjacent land in November. If Hartford delayed until spring, the most accessible copper seams might be legally encumbered. Grafton's correspondence with Amos Rask, archived at the Montana Historical Society, reflects calculated confidence rather than desperation. In a letter dated November 20th, he writes, "The weather holds fair, and our provisions are adequate for extended fieldwork. Holcomb believes the primary seam continues westward beneath the ridge. A winter traverse will confirm this and position us favorably for spring filing." There is no indication in the correspondence that Grafton considered the traverse risky. The maps available to him showed Cutter's Pass as a documented route. The 1889 survey included no annotations regarding seasonal closures. Grafton's prior experience in the Sierra Nevada had involved winter travel at similar elevations without incident. He had no reason, from a documentary perspective, to anticipate conditions meaningfully different from those he had encountered in California. Holcomb's field notes, partially recovered with the ledger, described the 9th of December as clear and cold, winds negligible, visibility excellent. The entry lists, or samples collected at 3 sites east of the pass, each marked with a cairn for future reference. The notes conclude with a single line. Grafton proposes we proceed through the defile this afternoon to avoid retracing the eastern approach. Estimate 4 hours to western egress. 4 hours was not an unreasonable estimate based on the mapped distance. 7 miles through level terrain could be covered in 2 hours by fit men. Grafton added margin for obstacles and gradient. His mathematics were sound, his assumptions were not. The final entry in the ledger, written in Rask's hand, is dated December 9th at 2:15 in the afternoon. It reads, "Entered pass, weather clear. Grafton estimates arrival Evaro by nightfall tomorrow." The entry is followed by blank pages. Lunt's testimony places the party at the eastern mouth of the pass shortly after midday. He watched them disappear into the gap and then drove his wagon back toward Missoula. He did not consider their departure unusual. He had delivered survey teams to remote trailheads dozens of times. Most returned on schedule. Those who did not had simply revised their plans. When Grafton failed to arrive in Missoula by December 15th, the consortium sent a telegram to the railhead at Evaro. The station master confirmed that no members of the Hartford party had boarded any train. A follow-up telegram to Lunt established that the party had entered the pass on the 9th and had not returned east. On December 17th, Amos Rask filed a missing persons report with the Territorial Marshal's office. The report noted that the men carried 6 days of provisions and should have exited the pass no later than December 10th. 7 days had elapsed. The temperature in Missoula had dropped below zero on the night of December 11th. Snow had fallen intermittently since the 14th. The initial assumption was delay, not disaster. Men became disoriented. They doubled back. They took shelter and waited for improved conditions. The marshal's office advised patience, but there was a detail in Lunt's statement that should have prompted immediate action. He had heard the sound. On the evening of December 9th, while camped 12 miles east of the pass, Lunt heard what he later described as a long roll, like thunder, but flat. The sound lasted approximately 10 seconds. It came from the direction of Cutter's Pass. Lunt noted it in his mental inventory of the day, but attached no significance to it. Thunder in December was uncommon, but not impossible. He did not associate the sound with the survey party. Only later, after the inquiry, did Lunt realize what he had heard. The reconstruction of the party's final hours depends on three sources: the recovered ledger, the position of artifacts found during subsequent searches, and the testimony of a Salish hunter named Peter Lefthand, who passed near the western mouth of Cutter's Pass on the morning of December 10th and observed evidence he did not immediately report. Lefthand's account, recorded in 1898 by Father Jerome Dast of the St. Ignatius Mission, is the only eyewitness description of conditions inside the pass during the relevant period. Lefthand did not enter the defile. He approached to within 50 yards of the western mouth, saw what he describes as new ice and broken stone, and withdrew. His reluctance to investigate further was not cowardice. It was adherence to traditional practice. The pass in winter was not a place to linger. What Lefthand saw was the aftermath. The ledger recovered in 1902 allows for partial reconstruction of the hours preceding that aftermath. The book was found lodged between two boulders approximately 1 mile inside the eastern mouth. The final entry, dated December 9th at 2:15, confirms the party's entry time. The pages that follow are blank, but forensic examination conducted in 1934 by a handwriting analyst retained by the Montana Geological Survey revealed faint pressure marks on the page immediately following the final entry. The marks suggest that Rask began another entry but did not complete it. The partial impressions are consistent with the phrase "ice underfoot" and possibly "walls narrow." The physical configuration of the pass can be inferred from topographic data collected during a 1926 survey and photographs taken during a 1938 search expedition. The eastern entrance begins as a gradual descent through a talus field. At approximately 1/2 mile, the walls close to less than 12 feet. The floor transitions from loose rock to exposed bedrock. This bedrock in winter becomes a tilted plain of verglas formed by seepage that freezes in layers. Grafton would have encountered this ice within 30 minutes of entry. The logical response would have been to turn back. But turning back meant retracing 6 miles of approach, losing daylight, and camping in exposed terrain with insufficient firewood. Turning back also meant admitting error, revising the schedule, and telegraphing the consortium that the winter survey had failed. Grafton had spent 4 days in the field. He had collected samples. He had drafted preliminary maps. He was 1 defile away from completing the traverse and catching the train at Evaro. 4 hours, 7 miles. He continued forward. The decision was not reckless in the moment. Grafton had training. He had colleagues. He had rope. Men had crossed worse terrain. Ice could be chipped. Footing could be secured. The pass was narrow, but it was finite. If they moved carefully, if they used the walls for balance, if they maintained interval spacing to distribute weight, they could navigate the ice and reach the far side before dark. What Grafton could not have anticipated, because the maps did not show it and the season had not yet triggered it, was the instability of the verglas itself. The ice in Cutter's Pass was not static. It formed through a process of accretion and ablation driven by diurnal temperature shifts. Water seeped from fissures in the schist during brief midday thaws, then refroze as temperatures dropped after sunset. Each freeze-thaw cycle added a new layer. By early December, the ice had thickened to several inches in places, bonding to the rock beneath but remaining mechanically unstable. The bond was strongest at the base, where older ice adhered to the stone. The surface layers, newer and less consolidated, formed a brittle crust. When weight was applied, the crust fractured. The fracture propagated through the ice matrix in a cascading failure. The process is analogous to calving in glacial ice, but compressed in scale. A single fracture can trigger sympathetic failures across a radius of several meters. In a confined space with vertical walls, the energy has nowhere to dissipate except upward and laterally. Modern avalanche science terms this a slab release. In 1896, there was no such terminology. Grafton stepped onto the ice. The ice fractured. The fracture propagated. The slab released. The sound Lunt heard 12 miles east was not thunder. It was displacement. Approximately 3,000 cubic meters of ice, rock, and frozen talus detached from the upper walls of the defile and collapsed into the channel. The collapse was not instantaneous. Witnesses to similar events in other alpine environments describe a progression. First a sharp crack, then a low rumble, then a sustained roar as the debris mass accelerates. The duration varies. 10 seconds is typical for events of this magnitude. The debris did not fall as a single block. It fragmented into thousands of pieces ranging from fist-sized stones to ice slabs weighing hundreds of pounds. The fragments descended in a chaotic tumble, ricocheting off the walls, colliding with each other, compressing the air ahead of them into a percussive wave. The wave alone can incapacitate. The debris itself is unsurvivable. Grafton, Holcomb, Tandy, and Rask were standing in the channel when the collapse began. There was no time to retreat. There was no lateral refuge. The walls were vertical. The floor was ice. The ledger, found a mile from the collapse zone, suggests that Rask dropped it during the initial forward traverse, possibly while navigating a particularly narrow section. The theodolite, recovered in 1926, was found crushed beneath a boulder weighing approximately 800 pounds, located 2 miles inside the eastern entrance. The surveying chain was never found. Holcomb's rock hammer was discovered in 1938, embedded in ice at a depth of 11 feet. No human remains were recovered. The mass of debris that filled the channel was later estimated at between 4,000 and 6,000 tons. It settled into a compacted matrix of ice, rock, and frozen soil that sealed the pass as effectively as poured concrete. Subsequent freeze-thaw cycles over the winter of 1896 to 1897 further consolidated the debris. By spring, the collapse zone was indistinguishable from the surrounding talus. Left Hand, approaching from the west on the morning of December 10th, saw fresh ice and displaced stone at the mouth of the pass. He saw no men. He saw no tracks leading out. He withdrew and did not report what he had seen because, from his perspective, there was nothing to report. The pass had closed. This was expected. This was normal. He did not know 4 men were inside. The first organized search commenced on December 22, 1896, led by Deputy Marshal Thomas Wickham and a volunteer party of 9 men recruited from Missoula and Evaro. The search focused on the western approach based on the assumption that the party had exited the pass and become disoriented in the low country beyond. No trace was found. A second search on January 7, 1897, entered the eastern mouth of the pass and advanced approximately 1 mile before encountering the debris field. Wickham's official report describes a wall of ice and broken stone blocking the channel to a height of 30 feet or more. The report notes that the obstruction appeared recent, but offers no speculation as to its cause. Wickham lacked the geological expertise to recognize the debris as the remnant of a collapse event. The search was suspended pending improved weather. In March of 1897, a thaw partially cleared the eastern approach. Wickham led a third expedition into the pass, this time advancing 2 miles before encountering impassable ice. He noted several pieces of equipment embedded in the frozen matrix, including a tin cup and fragments of canvas. He did not attempt excavation. The depth of burial and the hardness of the ice made recovery impractical with available tools. Wickham concluded that the party had been caught in a winter storm and buried by snowfall. His report recommended that further searches await complete seasonal thaw. That thaw never fully materialized. The debris field compacted over successive winters, becoming denser and more resistant to erosion. By the spring of 1898, vegetation had begun to colonize the exposed surfaces. By 1900, the collapse zone resembled natural talus. Amos Rask, unwilling to accept the loss of his nephew without definitive evidence, hired a private search team in the summer of 1901. The team included 2 experienced mountaineers and a mining engineer familiar with excavation in frozen ground. They spent 6 weeks systematically probing the debris field with iron rods. They recovered the ledger, several fragments of cloth, and a portion of the theodolite's brass fittings. They found no bodies. The engineer's assessment, filed with the consortium in September 1901, states, "The volume of displaced material and the depth of compaction render further excavation inadvisable. Any human remains present are likely fragmented and distributed across a lateral area exceeding 200 square meters. Recovery would require industrial equipment and weeks of labor. Even then, identification would be uncertain." Rask terminated the search. The territorial inquiry, convened in June of 1897, concluded that the party had perished due to exposure and adverse weather conditions while attempting a winter traverse of Cutter's Pass. The finding was technically accurate, but failed to identify the precipitating event. No mention was made of ice mechanics, slab failure, or the inherent instability of the pass in winter. The inquiry attributed the deaths to poor judgment in undertaking the traverse, but did not specify what alternative judgment should have been applied. Grafton was posthumously blamed for the decision, but the blame was diffuse and generic. He had been overconfident. He had ignored local warnings. He had prioritized schedule over safety. All of this was true, but none of it addressed the fundamental miscalculation. He had trusted the map. The 1889 territorial survey that documented Cutter's Pass had been conducted in August. The surveyors recorded width, gradient, and bearing. They noted the presence of seasonal water flow. They did not note ice formation because no ice was present. They did not classify the pass as avalanche-prone because they had no framework for such classification. They produced a map that was accurate in summer and lethally misleading in winter. Grafton used that map. He made a decision that appeared rational based on the information available to him. He was wrong, but his error was not a deviation from standard practice. It was an adherence to it. By 1910, the Hartford Mining Consortium had dissolved. The copper claims were never filed. The samples collected east of the pass were discarded during an office relocation in 1914. Cutter's Pass remained on territorial maps until 1923, when updated geological surveys reclassified it as seasonally impassable. The designation was bureaucratic, not preventative. By then, alternate routes had been established. No one used the pass anymore. In 1938, a team of geologists, conducting a regional survey of avalanche hazards, entered the eastern mouth and documented the collapsed debris. Their report, published in the Journal of Geological Research, describes the event as a textbook example of verglas slab failure in a confined channel. The report includes photographs of the theodolite and hammer. It makes no mention of the men who carried them. The last known reference to the Grafton party appears in a memoir written in 1949 by Peter Lefton's grandson, a schoolteacher in St. Ignatius named Joseph Lefthand. The memoir, self-published and circulated locally, recounts stories passed down through the family. One chapter describes his grandfather's encounter with the western mouth of Cutter's Pass in December of 1896. Joseph Lefthand writes, "My grandfather said he knew men had gone in. He had heard this from the wagon driver's talk in Missoula, but when he came to the mouth and saw the fresh stone and ice, he knew the pass had done what it does. He did not go closer. He said there was nothing to be done. The pass had closed." The phrasing is significant. Not, "the pass collapsed," not, "the pass was blocked." The pass had closed. Implicit in that verb is an understanding that the event was not anomalous. It was cyclical. It was expected. The pass closed in winter. This was its nature. But that nature was not encoded in the maps Grafton carried. It was not taught in the surveying curricula he had studied. It was not part of the professional knowledge base that informed his decision. It existed only in oral tradition, in the experiential knowledge of people who had lived beside the pass for generations and who avoided it not out of superstition, but out of survival. Grafton was not ignorant. He was educated, credentialed, and experienced. But his education did not include the hydrology of verglas. His credentials did not encompass indigenous spatial knowledge. His experience was drawn from environments that, while superficially similar, did not behave the same way. He made a decision that any professional of his era, given the same information and the same incentives, might have made. That decision killed him. The question that lingers, the question that the recovered ledger and the crushed theodolite and the testimony of Horace Lunt cannot answer, is whether the decision was avoidable. Could Grafton have known? Lunt had warned him, but the warning was vague. The Salish wouldn't go through in winter. That was not data. That was not specification. It did not explain the mechanism. It did not quantify the risk. It was the sort of statement a professional might reasonably dismiss as cultural preference rather than technical counsel. If Lunt had said, "The pass is an avalanche chute," would Grafton have listened? If the map had included a notation, "Impassable December through March," would he have turned back? We cannot know. What we know is that 4 men entered a narrow gap in the mountains on a clear December afternoon with adequate provisions, professional instruments, and a reasonable expectation of success. We know that they did not emerge. We know that their absence was noted, searched for, and eventually explained in terms that satisfied bureaucratic requirements but did not prevent recurrence. We know that the pass still exists. It still closes. It will close again. In 1972, the United States Geological Survey conducted a comprehensive remapping of the Bitterroot Range using aerial photogrammetry and ground-penetrating radar. Cutter's Pass was resurveyed and reclassified as a known avalanche path with high winter hazard. The designation triggered installation of warning signage at both the eastern and western approaches. The signs remain in place today. They read, "Do not enter November through April." They do not mention Grafton, Holcombe, Tandy, or Rask. They do not mention the Hartford Mining Consortium, the 1896 survey, or the decision made on December 9th. They do not need to. The warning is implicit in the geography. The pass closes. It has always closed. It will always close. The only variable is whether anyone is inside when it happens. On December 9th, 1896, 4 men were inside. That was the mistake. Not the ice, not the weather, not the equipment. The mistake was believing that a map could tell them everything they needed to know. It could not. It did not. And so they took the shortcut the locals feared, and no one returned.